And the first thing we're going to look at is population growth. And population growth is a seemingly very simple concept. And basically what it says is as long as the birth rate exceeds the death rate, populations are going to grow. There's nothing else to it. All you got to know is birth rate, death rate, and then the population goes up, right? So as long as the birth rate is greater than the death rate, a population will grow. Okay. Not only will it grow, but it will also experience, or will experience, something that's called exponential growth. And basically what this means is that there's no like steady slope in this graph. It's not going to be a linear growth because that wouldn't make any sense. So let's say there was a population that was a total population size of 5. There were 5 individuals, right? And then the next generation, there were 10 individuals, right? So there was an increase in 5. That's a pretty big increase, right? But if you were talking about a population of 1 million and then there was a population increase of 5, right? So you went from 1 million to 1,000,005. That wouldn't really make sense based on that population growth pattern, right? Because if you have 1 million people, there'd probably be more than 5 of them that reproduce, right? Especially if you're talking about the same population that at one time had a population of 5 and then have 5 more offspring, right? So it's not going to do that. It's going to go through what's called exponential growth, and exponential growth is going to look a little different based on whether it's asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. So in asexual reproduction, it's very easy to determine the rate because the population is just going to double every generation. So if you start with 1, 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 4, 4 goes to 8, 8 goes to 16, 16 goes to 32, etc., right? Okay, this is how asexual reproduction grows, and you can see that it's not a set amount. It goes from 1 to 2, so that's a difference of 1. This is a difference of 2. This is a difference of 4, difference of 8, difference of 16, right? So it's going up every, the number of new offspring is going up every year. For sexual reproduction, though, it's a little bit different. And that is due to the inherent differences of sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, first of all, we know requires 2 individuals, right? A male and a female. And because of that, that means that each male-female combination of parents has to have over 2 children, 2 offspring, in order for a population to grow. Okay? So each set of parents must have more than 2 offspring for a population to grow. Now, in the real world, this manifests itself as 3. You have to have 3 offspring, right? But overall, for a population, we're talking about anything greater than 2 as an average. So even an average of 2.01 per family would yield a population growth, as long as all those then led to all those got to reproductive capacity. All those were able to get to reproduce on their own. Okay, and then as you know, you have more offspring. It doesn't matter if the death rate is higher. And so this is another way to sort of game the system. If you are in a species that dies a lot, like an insect or something like that, or like a small mouse or a rabbit, it turns out it's much better to have much more offspring, many more offspring, because that offsets all the ones that died. Let's say you live in an area that has, pretty terrible survivability, like Africa, right? Having more offspring is a good way to make sure that the species still survives, because then even if a couple of them die, then like you still have some offspring that make it to reproductive age, right? Okay. So let's talk about what a population growth graph looks like. We're going to look at sort of the ideal one and then the actual one, or closer to actual one at least. Okay, so the first type of population growth, on both of these we're going to have population over here on the y-axis. And we're going to have time on the x-axis. Okay, this first graph is going to represent exponential growth, and so we're going to end up with something like this. Again, this is called exponential. And exponential growth is going to represent something that's called the biotic capacity of an organism. Sometimes that's also called biotic potential. Meaning, if all of the conditions were perfect, this is how many offspring this organism could have, and this is how fast it could get to this population. Now, this is never going to happen. It's never going to have an arrow that goes up infinitely. There has to be a limit, right? So what we tend to see much more often is this graph starting like it did before, like this, and then we'll just sort of dotted line it up from here. Okay, but we don't see that. What we see instead is a slowing of growth and then an ultimate leveling off of that growth. Okay, and there's a line, there's a point on here where that growth levels off. Okay, and the point where it levels off is referred to as its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity means the maximum number of organisms that any specific ecosystem can support, right? And so this again is your biotic potential up here. Biotic capacity or biotic potential. Okay, and then there's this space in between here. Right, you guys see this sort of void in between the biotic potential and the carrying capacity, or yeah, and the carrying capacity. This is referred to as ecological resistance. Okay, so the ecological resistance is basically what stops an organism from reaching its biotic potential and instead makes it reach a carrying capacity. Right? This type of growth here that we see, this blue line, is referred to as logistic growth. And it's in contrast, like I said, to exponential growth. Now, sometimes you will hear exponential growth referred to as the J curve. And you'll hear logistic growth referred to as the S curve. Because like in ecology, we don't want to get too crazy with our words. So J curve and S curve are recognizable, right? Because this kind of looks like a J and this kind of looks like an S. Right? All right. Great. So what is going to be the main thing that causes this ecological resistance and ultimately causes the carrying capacity? Well, it's going to be not the number of individuals total. It's going to be the number of individuals per unit area. Okay, because if you had an infinite number of space, or infinite amount of space and an infinite amount of resources, it's going to do this. Okay, so we need to know about something that's called population density. Basically, population density is just the number of individuals per unit area. Okay, and that is then going to lead to what's called a carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is generally represented by the letter K. Okay. We could say that the carrying capacity is the maximum population density that we could support, or the number of individuals that an ecosystem can support. So there's some of that ecology jibber jabber right there. So first of all, individuals we've got here. That means members of a species, and then that the ecosystem can support. So that those members of the species have to be supported by two different things. They have to be supported by the other populations within that community, right? Other living things there. And then they also have to be supported by the non-living factors, the abiotic factors, things like water and space and sunlight and things like that. Right? Yes? All right. When we're calculating carrying capacity, we need to be aware of a couple different things. First of all, if there are two organisms, two species that share the same resource, that we need to add those two species populations together in order to figure out their carrying capacity. So their carrying capacities essentially get combined. Okay? So if two species share a limiting resource, their populations must be combined to determine carrying capacity. And the second thing is that when we refer to carrying capacity for a predator-prey relationship, we know that the carrying capacity of the predator is always going to be directly related to the carrying capacity of the prey. So in predator-prey relationship, the carrying capacity of the predator depends on the carrying capacity of the prey. In other words, the population of the prey has to go up before the population of the predator can go up. Right? Okay, so what things determine the carrying capacity then? There's two classifications of things that will determine carrying capacity. One of them is called a density-dependent factor. And put very simply, density-dependent factors makes total sense based on the name. These are factors that will impact the population more as the density of that population goes up, right? So factors with increasing impact on a population as the population density increases. So, I don't know if any of you guys are into this, but if you are ever into the aquarium hobby, into having fish, density dependent factors are really important. Okay, basically you are making a little mini ecosystem, and you're holding these fish in a little mini ecosystem, and so you have to be able to support those fish in their ecosystem. And so you can make a choice. You can say, okay, first of all, I'm going to go way above the carrying capacity here, and I'm just going to like offset that by changing the water every week and making sure that I clean the tank a lot and stuff like that. That's your prerogative if you want to do that. But a lot of people who have aquariums, they don't want to do all that work. So they want to get their tank to the point where it's pretty much self-sufficient. Maybe you add a little food here and there, but for the most part, the food is being grown in the tank, the waste is being taken care of in the tank, and there's the right number of fish in the tank to be able to be supported by that, right? So that's all about density dependent factors. The first thing that you have to consider when you're looking at density dependent factors is just physical space, right? So is there enough room for everything in the tank to live, right? So physical space. Next, will the amount of stuff in that tank, am I going to grow plants in the tank? Am I going to grow, macroalgae and things like that that the fish can eat? Or am I going to feed the fish? Am I going to add food, right? Are there going to be enough like microscopic organisms, copepods and things like that for the fish to eat? Or again, am I just going to add, fish food, right? So food and water. Obviously, water refers to land animals and plants, because in the water there's not really a shortage of water. And then perhaps the most important thing here for an aquarium is the buildup of toxic waste. Okay, so fish live in, if you have an aquarium, they live in a very small sort of amount of water, right? And they poop in that water, right? And the poop has nitrogen compounds in it, specifically ammonia, right? And that ammonia needs to get broken down. So how does it get broken down within the tank is the question. How does ammonia ever get broken down? It's a better question, really. Yeah?
Maybe like some bacteria and stuff.
Yeah, so bacteria break it down, right? So you've got bacteria that feed off of the ammonia and break it down into nitrogen compounds, and then you've got other bacteria that feed off those nitrogen compounds and break them down, right? And break them down into atmospheric nitrogen and oxygen, right? So then you got to have the right amount of those bacteria. So you got to have a good amount of stuff in there where that bacteria can grow on or attach to, right? And then you also have to not overload them, right? So if you have 10 fish in a pretty small tank, there's not going to be enough bacteria to break down the waste of 10 fish. And so in the aquarium world, what they would say is your bio load, your amount of living things that are generating waste, is too high, right? And then the only way to get around that is to just do constant water changes, because you're going to end up with too much waste in there, and the waste is going to end up poisoning the fish, and then the fish die, right? So can you get a correct amount of fish for the correct amount of bacteria that are living there, so you never really have to change the water and everything sort of works on its own? Absolutely. This is how nature works, right? Everything's really a cycle, and if you can get your own little mini ecosystem going on, then that cycle can just keep going on, keep happening, right? But it turns out to be a pretty big problem if you don't heed the warnings there, because you will end up with this density dependent factor, which is the buildup of toxic waste. right? And then I'm going to put one last one on here that can be considered either density dependent or density independent, and that is disease. Because getting cholera and dying is bad regardless of the amount of population density. Like, you still die. But why would it ever be considered a density dependent factor? Yeah.
It needs like to have like a new host to continue to like live.
Yeah, it needs to have a new host. And if you are living in close proximity to a lot of other organisms, there's a good chance that there's going to be another new host around, right? There's a really good YouTube video. I don't even know. It's a mini documentary. I don't know. On something that's called, the title of the video is called America Pox. And it's really interesting, actually. It's about why when the early settlers of America came over, of North America rather, came over, why they brought disease with them, and why that killed off a lot of the Native Americans. And yet they didn't really die of any Native American diseases. There were no New World diseases that caused these settlers to die off in large numbers. There were instead just a bunch of diseases that were brought over with them that then killed off all the Native Americans. And really the main reason why that happened was because there were so many cities in the Western world, and those cities are just breeding grounds for diseases. Because if you have a disease that popped up in the New World, it might kill off a whole tribe, right? But they weren't living in such close proximity to other tribes that they were likely to spread them, right? And so it wasn't likely that these things could just continue on and continue to get bigger and bigger and badder like they would in the Western civilization because, like I said, they had these nice cities where they were just sort of like breeding pools where it was like killing a lot of people, but there were enough people coming into the city that it had a constant supply so they could keep, sort of having these diseases mutate and get worse and worse and worse. But there was nothing like that in the New World for them to come into. Anyways, if you're interested in that, it's a very interesting video, very cool video. And there's a follow-up to it, too, that talks about livestock and why livestock had a lot to do with it as well. Okay, let's talk about density-independent factors. Density-independent factors are factors that are going to negatively affect or negatively impact a population regardless of how many there are, regardless of the population density. Regardless of density. Okay, these are things like harsh climate. If the climate's bad, if it's cold, and there's a lot of snow and maybe a lot of wind, it's just bad to live there. And so it doesn't matter if there's 1 million organisms living there or 50 organisms living there. It's bad for everybody, right? Living in northern Canada during the wintertime is rough. And so a lot of things will die just based on the horrible, horrible climate there, right? Natural disaster. So let's say there's a volcanic island. And on that volcanic island, there's a population of lizards. And then the volcano erupts and covers the island in lava. It doesn't matter if there were 500 lizards or if there were 5 million lizards. All the lizards are going to be covered in lava, and therefore all the lizards die. Right? That's bad. All right. And the last one, like I said, disease. We said that disease is more likely to be spread if the population is dense, but it's equally bad for everybody that gets the disease. Okay. Let's talk about reproductive strategies. Okay, so we're going to look at two different things here as far as reproductive strategies go. The first thing we're going to look at is are selected versus K selected. Okay, so R refers to a population's growth rate. Okay, how much greater the birth rate is than the death rate. And so those populations that have very high growth rates are going to succeed in areas where there's not a lot of life yet, right? And so what we always talk about that, or we always say for that, is primary succession and secondary succession, right? New succession or a young ecosystem. And if it's primary succession, basically what that means is that a new ecosystem is starting from nothing, right? There's no soil even, there's just, rock, right? But secondary succession is when something has wiped out the entire ecosystem but has left the soil intact, right? So these R-selected species are ones that are going to grow very quick, and they're going to benefit from not having a lot of competition. They're going to come up here. They're going to reach carrying capacity. That's this point here. Okay? So this represents an R-selected species. Okay? And an R-selected species is, like I said, going to have a very high growth rate. And it's going to be favored in primary and secondary succession. High rate of growth. And favored in primary and secondary succession. Okay, so what would be an example of something like this, of an R-selected species that grows really fast, but maybe you don't see it as much near the end of a community and near the end of a community's development? Yeah. Lichen is a really good thing. Lichen doesn't grow really, really fast. Lichen is actually something that's referred to as a pioneer species. So it's like sort of the ultimate primary succession species. But in secondary succession, lichen's really not going to be all that well off. Think about like a forest fire or something that resets. What's the first thing that always grows after a forest fire? Well, the pine cones can start to germinate, but what do you see? What? Grasses, right? Lots of grasses. A whole, grassy plain, right? So grasses grow really fast, and they grow to like maybe 3 or 4 feet tall or something like that. And then they pretty much just stop there, okay? And then you've got this other group down here that's going slow and steady, right? And they're going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, like this, until they reach their carrying capacity, okay? And when they do that, when they reach their carrying capacity, they are also competing for resources with this R-selected species, and so this R-selected species sees their population decrease, okay? So this blue line represents a K-selected species. Like I said, R is the variable that we use for population growth rate, but K is the one that we use for carrying capacity. So these are K-selected. And K-selected species are going to grow slower, but they're going to be favored at carrying capacity. Okay? These would be like trees. So trees grow slowly. They are going to be underneath all that grassy stuff, all the grass that's growing originally in this secondary succession. But eventually, they're going to get tall enough to the point where the grass can't grow anymore because they're shading out all the sunlight. And so they will then be favored. And when you see a community that's then only trees, the way that we refer to that is a climax community. And a climax community, like I said, is going to have mostly K-selected species, almost no R-selected species still in that community. Okay? So this is R versus K-selected. And this is population. And this is time. Okay, and the other thing that I want to talk to you about is another type of reproductive strategy. And it's called a survivorship curve. Okay, and so in a survivorship curve, over here on this side, you've got the number of surviving individuals, or actually let's call this the percentage of surviving individuals. And then on the bottom, you're going to have the percentage of their lifespan. So you've got basically all the organisms are going to start up here at 100%, right? And then at the end, they're going to end at 0%. Okay? So, sometimes organisms have a much higher chance of getting to the 50% point, 50% lifespan point. Okay? So, let's say you start at 100%, and most of those organisms make it to the 50 point. Okay? Then after the 50 point, they start to see a little bit more decline until here's 100% of their lifespan. And so they decline and get to 100% lifespan. So these organisms are going to use a lot of resources to make sure that whatever offspring they have are going to be fit to get to their 50% point, right? To get 50% of their lifespan. Generally speaking, 50% of the lifespan is definitely going to include reproductive age. And so we can think that like everybody who makes it to like here is going to be able to produce offspring, right? Okay. Now, there's another group, okay? And this first group here is called type 1. There's another group that just says, screw it. We're going to play the numbers game, all right? We're going to make hundreds of thousands of offspring, and maybe like 10 or 15 of them will get to reproductive age. But it doesn't matter, because we're just going to like play the numbers game, okay? So insects, some insects will lay, like I said, thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs, and maybe 10 or 15 of them will get to reproductive age, right? But if it was 2 organisms that laid those 10 or 15,000 eggs, and 10 or 15 total got to reproductive age, that's still 15 offspring per 2 individuals. That's a massive population growth rate, right? So all they really have to have out of those, let's say 15,000 eggs that they lay, all they really need is 2.1 of them to get to reproductive age for that population to grow, right? So you tend to see something that looks like this. This is called type 3. Insects and fish and amphibians are often type 3. Okay? And then you got type 2. Type 2 just kind of shoots down the middle here. From this point to this point. And basically what happens for type 2 is like, you're just equally likely to die at any point in your life, okay? So if you think about like a bunny rabbit or like a mouse or something like that, they're equally likely to get eaten whether they're young or old. Because when they're young, they're generally protected by their parents, right? And then when they go out on their own, they might get eaten at some point. But they're not any more likely to get eaten today than they are to get eaten tomorrow or the next day or the next day or the next day. They're just in a constant danger of being eaten by something. right? And so their lifespan goes like this, where they're just equally likely to die at any point. Okay? Humans are type 1. It is unlikely that you will die in your childhood. It's unlikely that you will die before, let's say, 30, right? And then after 30, everything kind of goes to crap. Like your body starts breaking down, and all the horrible decisions that you made in your youth will start creeping up on you, and then you have more of a chance to die, right? Whereas in an insect in type 3, is going to again lay a bunch of eggs, and maybe some of those eggs make it to reproductive age, but the vast majority of them will not. They'll get eaten by something, or they just won't hatch, or something like that, right? So type 1, likely to reach the 50% point of lifespan. Type 2, equally likely to die at any point. And then type 3, much more likely to die early in lifespan. If you're a bug and you've made it to like the 25% point, you're golden. You're probably going to make it all the way, right? Because this is saying most of your bugs are going to die here, and then if you get to this point, like you're probably going to get all the way, right? So this was like humans. This was like mice. And this is like insects. Questions on that?